Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Briancrombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We've had, an interesting, fascinating announcement in the last couple of days that we're going to buy a whole bunch of fighter jets, and these are fighter jets that I think people talked about. Was it a decade ago or something like this? And we turned them down, and then we reconsidered it. And so I read a really fascinating article by Richard Shimooka. Shimooka, I apologize, who is with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And it's written, and it's titled, Canada's Fighter Jet Debacle is a Costly Ode to Unseriousness. Richard, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Thanks for having me. Good, great.
So tell me a little bit, let's just to start with, give us a little background on what it is we're ordering, and then I'll turn to why it's a debacle, if I could.
So basically, we're ordering 88 F-35A models. These are considered, these are conventional takeoff and landing fighter jets. They're basically a straight replacement for existing CF-18s. It's currently the most produced fighter in the world. It will probably replace most of our NATO allies' fighters for the next 40 years, as well as several of our Asia Pacific allies. Basically, it's the next generation of fighters, and that includes a lot of things. A lot of people look at its kind of low observable or stealth technology as being a feature. That's not fully accurate. That's one component of its capability, but a significantly large one is its data management system, which is essentially almost about half of its cost. And it kind of reflects how warfare is kind of evolving, for the last 10 and perhaps for the foreseeable future.
Now, you were very negative about the government's decision, but it seems like, and you said that it suggests that this is unseriousness, and that it shows a lack of leadership in government, but it also seems like you actually agree that the plane is the right plane to buy. Is that correct?
Yeah, so my criticism mostly aimed at the process. And I think how we've gotten to this stage, basically 13 years since the Harper government initially said they were going to sole source this aircraft, has really identified some pretty serious failings with not just the procurement system in Canada, but how we sort of talk and discuss defense within Canada writ large. And a lot of the issues that we have, I think, in Canada with, how we conceive of our security, what do we need to provide, Canadian security, and what do our allies need, just aren't well understood by the public or even many members of our sort of political elite, for lack of a better word. And when I point to that is in 2010, Department of National Defense recommended that we sole source acquire the F-35. They thought they didn't need the competition. And specific to that is because on three major areas, the cost, the capability, and the industrial benefits, there was no competition. Having a competition actually wouldn't make much sense because this aircraft was significantly cheaper than anything that was on the market. It was significantly more capable, and the industrial capability side, basically the contracts that Canada was going to get through what's known as the Joint Strike Fighter Partnership Program was so much better than any other option that would be presented that having competition really didn't make sense. It would save Canada a lot of money to do so. Now, that recommendation, if we look today at how DND, the government analyzed and selected the F-35, nothing really changed. You have variances, but the variances were within tolerances of what you would expect as 5-10% maybe on cost, if that. The capability, F-35 still remains the most capable option, and the industrial benefits are still far outstrip any other option. It didn't change. So what's changed is basically our political, or the collective political conception within Canada of what is the best option. And so
in addition, what's changed is the war in Ukraine, I guess.
Certainly, I think that's kind of underlying a point that Canada needs to provide for its security. And if you sort of see how Canada's discussed these issues with its allies, where, especially the United States, but also our NATO allies, we're not seen as being a very good sort of ally in the sense that we're holding up our end of the bargain of NATO. Canada's prosperity is heavily linked to our overall very good security situation, and NATO is a key provider of that. And when we start underspending in defense, and our allies who are facing kind of the threat of Russian aggression on their borders says, well, we need help. We're helping you. We're defending for you. Where are you? And we are unable to provide anything. That's kind of underlying point. And we're starting to see that pretty significantly. You've seen several meetings within NATO groupings, a number of bilateral meetings with the United States, who we have a binational command to defend our entire continent with, say, this is not sufficient what you're doing. You're well below the threshold of what is considered being acceptable or as being responsible. The 2% GDP is a rough measure of that, and you kind of need to do more. And this is basically one of the areas we need to spend on, is procurement and providing for our capabilities.
We're having a chat tonight about the government's purchase of jet airplanes to replace the fleet of jet airlines that I think people have thought were out of date for a long period of time. I think it was 14 years ago that our guest has said that we previously had a plan to potentially replace this fleet of airplanes. We're going to take a break and come back and discuss this in a little bit more detail in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga Night 60. Our topic tonight is defense and specifically a Canadian government announcement just a little while ago that we're going to buy a whole bunch of new airplanes and pretty fancy ones to replace our fleet of jet fighters. Our guest is Richard Shimooka, who is a senior research fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's really quite an interesting guy. He has been a senior research fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute since 2017. Before that, he was a research fellow at the Conference of Defense Associations Institute. Before that, he was a deputy administrator at something called Wesnoth Inc. He was a research consultant. He was a research fellow at Queen's University and a visiting fellow in the Center for International Relations. And he's got a master's in economic strategic studies at a university that I can't pronounce in Wales.
Aberystwyth.
Aberystwyth. Thank you. And he's got a Bachelor of Arts in Political Studies from the Queen's University. Quite the background. And I guess that you're an expert in defense and foreign policy research. You've got a long history, I understand, of applying your skills to study a range of complex social and organizational issues. And you've been writing a fair amount of analyses, according to your LinkedIn profile, quite prolific in your criticism of our defense strategies. Let me just try to put you on the spot though. Like, instead of being negative and saying it's a lack of leadership, why didn't you say, "Good on you, you finally made the right decision"?
It's tough to say that. I guess it's easy. It is easy to be critical at times. Yeah, we've made the right decision, certainly, and I think that's important. I think I'm going to say something negative, and I'll come back to something positive. We'll make it do that way. I think what's really, really been ruinous is the effect on morale for the Canadian Armed Forces by this decision, specifically within the Air Force. And this is the story that you don't really see, because many personnel in the Canadian Armed Forces have this kind of can-do mentality where they say, well, I'm going to just suffer through this. I'm going to work through this. And specifically within the fighter force, the technicians, the maintainers, and the pilots, it's a pretty critical role. It's a high skill, high tempo role. And what's happened basically, because we've pushed back this decision, especially after 2015, where it looked like we would not get the F-35. It would actually look like they were trying to push us towards the Boeing Super Hornet, which would not have been the right choice for the Canadian Armed Forces, because the aircraft is basically a generation earlier, and it's less capable than the F-35. A lot of these pilots got really upset. They have quality of life issues anyways, because they're deployed to places like Cold Lake and Baggetville, and a lot of them sort of started leaving. And so right now, the Canadian Armed Forces, especially the people that maintain our fighter capability, basically have left. We're really right down to the nub with amount of people. We're barely able to actually maintain our NORAD commitments to defend the North, or defend our sort of continental North America. And so that part of it is really ruinous to me. So yes, it's great. I fully agree with you. Like, getting the F-35 is a good choice. There's some positives to getting the F-35. A lot of people point out we're getting a much more mature aircraft than if we had bought it, let's say, 8 years ago or 13 years ago. We would have bought an earlier block, which would have not been as capable as this next generation called the Block 4, which is what we're buying. That's really important. But when I look at where the Royal Canadian Air Force is at right now, and I look at where it's going to be for the next 10, maybe even 15 years, we're just not able to do anything. And the government's acknowledged this. The government used to provide provide aircraft to something called the NATO Air Policing Mission. We should deploy every year a capability to Romania or Iceland to defend, and the Baltics to defend their airspaces against Russian incursion. We're not going to be able to do that probably for next 10, most likely next 15 years. And I think that's part of the reason why, especially in this article, the process to me has been so negative to the capability of the armed forces that it's hard to sort of say, yes, it's good. I'm good job. You made this decision. It's come at such a severe cost, and it's really hard to ignore that, especially for our collective sort of security, or our collective collective defense.
So your criticism is mainly on process, and you thought that this whole procurement process was flawed, but in the end they made the right decision. So if the process is flawed, why did they come up with the right decision in the end?
Because it was really difficult to not pick the F-35. That's basically it. And that kind of goes back to 2010, and then a second time when Prime Minister Harper was basically a week away from actually selecting the F-35 a second time. Because of those three aspects, the three buckets I was talking about, the cost, the capability, and the industrial benefits. I believe, and there's pretty good evidence to suggest that the Trudeau Liberals at the beginning of in 2015 tried to exclude the F-35. They even said that. I mean, they said it publicly, and then they did something called the interim buy, which was an attempt to sole source 18 Boeing Super Hornets to get around it. Legally, you can't actually exclude a fighter or exclude a potential competitor unless you want to try to test your waters in a legal courtroom. So they allowed the F-35 to sort of join the competition, the ultimate competition that just ended last year. So in a lot of ways, it was tough to exclude. You couldn't really exclude legally, and then when you actually had it in the competition, the end of the day was that the F-35 won. So that's probably the easiest way I can kind of explain it. If you want to think about sort of the brass tacks of it, is that also there's a lot of jobs that are riding around the F-35. Canada's already obtained, I believe, around $3 billion worth of industrial contracts over the past 20 years, producing parts where every single F-35 has been produced. And a lot of them are in some pretty key areas of the country. Several firms in Quebec, several firms in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia, several ones in the Greater Winnipeg area. So it made that also really difficult to sort of just cut bait on it, so to speak, and sort of face the repercussions in some pretty important voting areas as well.
It's the plane that most of NATO flies. Is that not correct?
It will be. So the program of record right now is around 3,000 aircraft, which is a huge amount. If you look at it, in the past couple of years, you've had Finland selected, Germany's selected as a supplement to their existing fleet. The United Kingdom, Italy. There's Denmark, Norway, Netherlands. And there's a few potential offers that are coming up as well. So there's
when thinking about what you should have in a fleet, in several fleets, is it best to have the same aircraft, or maybe some diversity in those aircraft?
So that's a good question. In the case of the F-35, or so going back to what I was saying at the very start about what is the F-35, and I kind of alluded to it being a bit of a flying supercomputer. The way the warfare is going is really about drawing large amounts of data in from a large amount of sources and sort of analyzing them and creating useful sort of outputs of what a pilot should do, or what targets are out there and how to sort of prosecute them. And that's the real critical aspect of, as saying, the F-35. Now, there's not many capabilities that have been so developed in this fashion. And so this kind of the ability to bring together, to network together a lot of these sort of capabilities is still sort of in its early stage within air forces. So when you think about let's say, other sort of aircraft that have that, it's really, you're going to see the next generation aircraft that are coming in the next 10 years, or sorry, about 15 to 20 years after this one, that are going to have that capability out of the box. And instead, the other options are basically ones that have some of it, but it's really not capable. And that's partly because the F-35 kind of was in a new generation, and there wasn't other aircraft that competed against it so equally. So to your question, sorry to take it around the way, is that you would want to have some diversity. Diversity is a good thing, but
Yeah.
in this case, there isn't another option that kind of offers that in the same kind of way.
I was up in Ottawa this past weekend and drove by 24 Sussex, and we got into this discussion about why we aren't fixing up the Prime Minister's residence, and that Harper didn't want to do it, and Trudeau doesn't want to do it, and no one takes the political, flack from spending so much money on something. Is that really just the problem here? Is that that we've turned too much of procurement into partisan political infighting?
I think so to some degree. I think that's certainly the case of the F-35, because the real first efforts to denigrate it came with Michael Ignatieff in 2011 in that election. And then you saw in 2014 with candidate Trudeau, who said that I'm not buying this aircraft, period. And there's a very famous kind of speech that he did, I believe it was in Halifax, where he said, this aircraft isn't really necessary for Canada and all that. And then today, last week, they basically selected it. So I think that's part of it. And I think that that's problematic. I think there's a lack of general understanding of a lot of defense issues in Canada. And I think that really allows a lot of sort of misinformation or efforts to sort of denigrate things that are really kind of complex, that have a lot of sort of underpinning of logic and sort of thinking behind it. But if you want to make political hay out of it, you can easily sort of just say, oh, this doesn't work, and sort of kind of put together some views on it that kind of express that. And I think that's a bit problematic. I think that right now we have a Canadian the Canadian Surface Combatant Program, which is a large frigate class that's going to replace our existing Halifax class frigates. And it's having some cost overruns. There's some estimates of its costs that are significantly above what Department of National Defense is suggesting. And you're already starting to see some of the sort of criticism about, this is bungled process and this and that. And people are trying to sort of make political hay out of it. So I think there are many problems with Canadian defense. That is certainly not the only one, but I think that is one of them. Is politicization has caused issues for certain programs, and it certainly did with the F-35.
Didn't we have some big helicopter program that we canceled and cost us $1 billion or something like that?
Yes, and that was the Sea King replacement program. The EH-101 was its replacement, and that was done by Jean Chrétien, excuse me. In 1993, he made a campaign promise saying that these were referring to them as Cadillac aircraft, and canceled it. And then they had to have a competition to replace them about 8 years later. They selected another aircraft, or another helicopter, excuse me, and that helicopter had a lot of issues as well, because the choice probably should have been the EH-101 again, because again, that was the aircraft that had been selected before. But it wasn't seen as palatable, so to speak, or there was different requirements put on. And the helicopter that we got, which is the existing CH-148 Cyclone, it had to be developed right from scratch, and that really caused issues. So yeah, I mean, that happened once before. Certainly cancellation, whether or not the selection of the Cyclone was specific, was that up to politics, I don't believe so necessarily, but it's certainly, the initial cancellation caused some serious issues.
We're chatting tonight about jet airplanes for the Canadian Defense, the Canadian Armed Forces, Canadian Air Force. We're going to take a break with Richard Shimooka and be back with him in just 2 minutes. And we're going to talk a little bit more widely about, more broadly about what we need to do in Canada with defense spending. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Richard Shimooka. He is a senior research fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's an expert on defense and foreign policy issues. He writes prolifically for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute on defense issues. He's got a master's from the University of Wales and a Bachelor of Arts from Queen's University, all on policy, politics, and strategic studies. Richard, I wonder if you could broaden and elevate just for a second here, if we could, and talk about defense spending in total. I've spoken to a couple of different people that say that jets are one issue, but we also got frigates that are a problem, and helicopters that are a problem, and tanks that are a problem, and other things. Tell me, how bad is our situation right now in Canadian defense, and you know, we're giving away a lot of our stuff to Ukraine. It's going to get even worse, is it not?
Oh, the word is dire. I mean, last fall, you basically had the Chief of Defense Staff call for an operational pause. It's called reconstitution, and it was divesting Canada or the Canadian Armed Forces of any sort of ancillary activities that would basically hurt readiness. We're sucking wind. I mean, that's just the reality.
Dire, sucking wind. Those are the words that foreign policy analysts use to describe our situation. Pretty good.
I mean, no, and I mean, you know what? If you understand what General Eyre is saying with the reconstitution, or it is pretty bad, and there's no way to sort of describe it other way. I'll give an example. Canada. President Biden has reportedly asked Justin Trudeau to deploy force to Haiti to secure or to sort of stabilize that state. And I believe the reason why that we've refused thus far and just try to provide as some armored vehicles and whatnot is because the Canadian Armed Forces cannot deploy anything. If to do so would actually really hurt the army to the extent that they would just not be able to deploy anything else beyond that for years. And that's because in so many areas you have a manning crisis where certain critical trades are at 50% manning, and at 50% manning you can't actually do anything because you have to train your forces going forward in order to provide useful capability in the future years. So if you have nobody to train things and you're deploying them over and over, people leave because they retire or whatnot. And that means you don't have people later on to actually deploy the forces. And we've been doing this for over a decade now. And we're at such a state now that we're only able to do the most barest minimums of our requirements, which is, for example, the fighter force, we're only able to provide security only for North America, and that's it. So everywhere you look in the Canadian Armed Forces, except for a few small areas, you're just seeing this really serious situation where where they're just unable to do very much at all. And
but didn't we have a force in Afghanistan that we were quite proud of?
Oh, absolutely, and it was an exceptional force. And if you talk to our allies, Americans and whatnot, they will gladly point out, is like, I remember when you guys were in Afghanistan, you were excellent. What basically happened since Afghanistan, you had significant cuts to the military under Prime Minister Harper. You had sort of budget slashed specifically on training and recruitment, and that really sort of hurt the forces. That the cuts weren't as bad coming out of there into the Trudeau government, but there's just not been any sort of focus on it. Procurement's kind of lagged significantly for 5 years, and then you had COVID as well, which a lot of individuals were in that environment decided I think this is time for me to leave, especially when I see a government that hasn't really put much effort into developing the forces. And as I was sort of mentioned before, the quality of life isn't great. I mean, it's a tough life to be part of the CAF. You're deployed a large amount of time. You're on training for a large amount of periods. The bases are in some pretty remote areas, and it's difficult for them to sort of have families and move across the country over and over again, and that's really affected a lot of these individuals. So,
but
in the face of all that, it's been serious.
Force, and if nothing, else this last year, hasn't it shown us that we have to have a reasonable force? You know, a year ago, I was doing interviews with people that were saying that there's a chance that Russia could attack Ukraine and that Russia was massing forces. And other people said, oh, no, it'll never happen. It'll never happen. There's not going to be another war in Europe. But February 24th happened. And right now, some people think that we are at risk of Putin attacking Baltic states if he wins in Ukraine, or what if he actually had some sort of ambitions in the Arctic? So don't we need to have a force?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and that's basically one of the realities I think a lot of Canadians have not really sort of been told, or have not really been fully explained, that one of the things that the government has always been, oh, well, we're doing okay, and the military is doing okay, and we're doing everything we can. But especially in the last 7 years with the Trudeau government, there's been a real sort of pause, for lack of a word, or a gap between some of the really critical acquisitions. The F-35 or the CF-18 replacement is one. I mean, this Canadian shipbuilding program the National Shipbuilding Strategy, which produces not just the frigates, but tank offshore Arctic patrol vessels and sort of refueling vessels for the Navy. That's taken a lot of time. And there was a push, I should say, to start doing spending into the early 2020s, and that gap has really affected as well the Canadian Armed Forces' ability to show that it's actually gaining forward. It's actually developing. It's out there, sort of meeting some of the new challenges. If you talk to a lot of the forces, or a lot of members of the forces, the cracks are really apparent to them, but they're not really apparent to Canadians. And when for the government to actually say, well, we're going to try to add more troops to our Latvia mission, or do something more for our NATO allies in East, they're just not able to, because they just haven't really been. It has been invested properly, and this is not just, I should say, just with the Trudeau government. This extends for quite some time. But
when you think about what Canada's been proud of in regards to its armed forces, doing a peacemaking mission in Haiti would be exactly consistent with what people have been most proud of.
Certainly. It's the thing is that there just isn't the rotation of troops available. This is part of the issue, is that.
So if you were the Minister of Defense or head of the armed forces, you would turn down the Haiti opportunity that Biden has requested?
There's just no ability for him to do so. To do so would really detrimentally impact the Canadian Armed Forces' ability to deploy after Haiti.
But maybe we need that kind of an emergency to get our act together.
I see. The thing is, the processes to generate forces is really complex, and it's just, there isn't, like, there's so many parts to it that in order to, you can't shortchange it. And you would
okay. Yes. If I had you on my show a year ago today, what would you have told me the probability that Russia was going to attack Ukraine?
At the time, I actually wrote about it. I didn't think they would do the full-scale assault. I thought that they would probably try to bite off a much smaller piece than they actually did. I mean, this issue this is commonly referred to as the bow wave, which is an issue where we kind of defer procurement, or we defer sort of stuff, and it starts to build up. This is not a new problem. This is a problem that I've talked about since probably 2016, 2017, and now it's starting to come home to roost. But
if they attack the Baltics, we're part of NATO. We have an obligation to go support, correct?
Yes, and we have troops there. We have the enhanced forward presence that currently.
So what's the probability that you think they'll go beyond Ukraine and attack the Baltics?
At this stage, not too high. I think that they're just trying to extricate them out from a really bad decision on February 24th. I think but I mean, predictions are tough, right?
Very tough. But that's my point, is that people, even smart people like you, didn't think that they were going to do the invasion that they ended up doing. I had really smart people on my show that they're not going to actually attack. They're going to bluster. They're going to put their forces there, but they're not actually going to attack. And they did. And so I just worry that we need to be ready for a potential attack. And whether it's a 5% probability or a 50% probability, there's still some probability that Russia will attack countries other than Ukraine.
Oh, absolutely. And the best way to think about it is the Canadian Armed Forces as an insurance policy, a national insurance policy for exactly events like this. Is that you can never you can't fully predict. Again, you're right. I didn't predict the full invasion, right? And I was wrong. And if you aren't if you're unprepared for these events, if you do not have the capability to actually, plan or defend from such aggression, this is the outcome. You're just not, you're going to get steamrolled. And I think even on a local basis is that it's the same. Canadian Forces, a big part of their mission is the sort of disaster response and part of the reason why the Canadian Forces is in such a situation is they're being called increasingly out to more and more, major disasters across this country, like last year with the flooding in British Columbia. And that's really sucking their available manpower away from this core mission, which is, security from abroad. So it's all to say I fully agree that I think that is one of the core reasons why we need to have a strong, robust defense or capability in the Canadian Armed Forces.
What do we need to do with the Navy?
Probably see through a very expensive frigate replacement program, because if you were to cancel the existing Canadian surface command program, you're just going to push back the Navy a couple, maybe half a decade, a full decade, with a frigate replacement, and they cannot go any further with the existing Halifax frigates. We've run them really hard for the past 20 years, and they're often deployed heavily to abroad, and they're not looking in great material shape. So the Canadian Surface Command program is going to go above cost. I don't think some of the top end high projections like they're being done by the Parliamentary Budget Office are going to come true, but it's going to be higher. But we're going to have to see it through because we don't have any other options, and the alternative is even worse.
And you're only talking about frigates. Do we have aircraft carriers? Do we have submarines? Nope. Do we have anything else?
We have submarines. There is some talk that we will be talking about replacing them. That's going to be a pretty significant program of record. There's several countries that produce them: South Koreans, the Japanese, and the Swedes. But that's probably in the next. We probably won't see anything for 10 years before a foreign-built sub actually appears in Canadian waters.
And we don't have one aircraft carrier.
No, we do not. We have nope. We divested our last aircraft carrier, I believe, in the mid 1960s, in 65, I believe.
Do we need one?
No, I think that's probably a capability that's a little too far. A big part of what the Royal Canadian Navy does is actually operate within U.S. American battle groups, which do have carriers as the core of them. If we're talking about protecting our Arctic sovereignty, what we really need is submarines, specifically nuclear submarines. That's a third rail, a very difficult sell. So I think we're looking at a replacement for a submarine program that's going to be more capable, perhaps what the Japanese produce. They produce a very effective sort of large submarine that would fit our purposes, but we'll see.
There's a report in the paper that Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is going to ask for a bunch of tanks. Should we be giving him tanks?
It's going to be tough. So when we purchased the Leopard 2s way back in the late 2000s, I should say, we basically, for lack of a better, right-sized our force. We didn't really have any tanks that are in depots. We don't kind of store them. They're all used, or they're being refurbished for reuse, so to speak. And the ability for the Canadian Armed Forces to give tanks at all is limited, because that's just going to impact our ability to do anything in the future. If there's a contingency where, let's say, we have to provide more armored vehicles to Latvia because Russian aggression increases, it would directly come out of our ability to deploy additional forces there. And if we were to give them, it would be a long time till we get replaced, because the production lines for them are working pretty hard right now, and there aren't very many being produced as well. So if we do, it would be a decision where we would have to sacrifice our own capability to actually deploy the Canadian forces.
So what do you think? Should we or should we not?
Those are tough questions. I think we could probably give them maybe 10.
20. And how many do they want?
Oh, they would take anything they want. But the reality is that, and they're going around to everybody to ask them. You're seeing them. The Poles are about, the Polish government, I should say, is about to send them a significant amount. A large part of it is actually contingent upon German approval. Germany has a lot of export license controls on the use of their tanks. They don't like them being sent to places that are actually used in war. It's part of the post-World War II kind of legacy of, they're very reticent about how their weapons are used. So they've been kind of skittish about it. So there's a bit of a political hot potato occurring right now about whether or not Germans are actually going to provide it or provide those kind of releases for their weapons. I think it would help. I think there's a lot of other countries that have a lot more tanks that are actually just sitting, not being used at all in Europe, that should probably be in the front line, especially after we just gave them about a $500 million worth of air defense equipment, which is a pretty significant donation on the part of Canada.
Canada gave $500 million of defense equipment.
They've announced that we're going to provide $500 million for a advanced medium-ranged air defense system that we're going to purchase for the Ukrainians through the United States and deliver to them.
We're going to chat for a little bit more right after 2 minutes of messages with Richard about what's going on in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. Stay with us, everybody. Fascinating conversation.
Okay.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. It's really interesting to chat with such an expert as Richard Shimooka, who is a senior analyst with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute on defense and security issues. Richard, I got to ask you a question. You know, the Secretary of Defense, I think it was in the United States, made a comment that this war in Ukraine is something that actually could deplete Russia's resources, and that was a good idea. I'm paraphrasing big time now, but something like that. Is that true? Do you think actually, you know, if Russia is the fear, is the entity that we need to be fearful of, isn't actually supplying everything we can to the Ukrainians smart, because it'll just use up a whole bunch of stuff that Russia's got that they're not going to ever think about using against Lithuania or Estonia or Canada?
Oh, it already has. I mean, if you look at what's going on the battlefield on a minute basis, Russia's wrecked basically the very point of its sort of military spear. Much of their top tanks are gone, just destroyed, captured, whatever. And right now, what you're watching, you hear about these sort of military mobilizations of 300,000 people. They don't have equipment. So they're basically sending people over the trenches, very much reminiscent of World War I, in order to sort of try to win, or whatever winning is in Ukraine, or trying to achieve some sort of objective there. And certainly what Secretary of Defense Austin is saying is accurate. I think that we've been able to sort of blunt the Russian ability to wage war, which they seem very, very happy to use over the past 20 years since Vladimir Putin has kind of entered office. So certainly I think that's the case. But given how they've become an international pariah, I cannot see how they will not try to rebuild their military force after this war is over, in order to try to continue on the way they. Yeah, exactly. Because their economy is in shambles. What other options will they have to sort of pursue their broader aims? It's probably going to be heavily based on military.
Richard, we could probably do a whole show on this sometime, and if you're interested, I'd love to. But how does this thing all end in your mind?
We're going to see a spring offensive. One or both sides are going to try a major offensive, and whatever, there's going to be political competition. I see it's really difficult for Russia to lose all the territory it's taken. I see it's difficult for the Ukrainians to lose in the way that being taken. I just don't see that as being possible. So there's going to be a line somewhere in the existing Ukrainian territory, and somebody's going to have to achieve that agreement. And that's basically what I say.
Richard, thank you very much for joining us. If people want to follow some of your comments on social media or at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, what's the best way to follow your brilliant writing?
I write a piece on the Hub every couple of weeks here, thehub.ca, sort of on defense issues. If you look on my bio on macdonaldlaurier.ca, they post basically anything that I publish. So you'll see whether it be interviews like this, studies that I do, or other news articles I write.
Well, I really enjoyed your your article on the purchase of the jets. And so I really thank you for that and look forward to chatting with you again in the future sometime.
Thanks for having me.
That's our show for tonight, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. I remind you that I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can even stream me online from the West Coast, Langley, BC at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody. Thanks, Richard.